Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel Tutt here with Emancipations podcast for a very exciting interview with Michel Behrent, who is a professor of history at Appalachian State University and is an author of numerous works and interventions into the work of Michel Foucault, into the wider milieu of French theory. Professor Behrent has been one of the most important voices in a very fascinating debate regarding Michel Foucault's relationship to neoliberalism. And more recently, he has been doing work on lesser known French philosophers, and that is the topic of today's discussion. Amérique Monville, who is a former guest of Emancipations, joined me to discuss the work of Michel Clouscard. And as folks probably know, if you follow my work, I have been absolutely fascinated with this French philosopher, Michel Clouscard, who I think died in the mid-2000s, but he was of the same generation of the giants of French theory and post-war French thought, from Deleuze, Foucault, Alain Badiou, Baudrillard, Jacques Derrida, and so on. And, you know, I think so many of us in today's Anglo-American academy have really felt the influence of these giants. And I think that it's fair to say there was something like a philosophical renaissance in France after World War II. And one of the interesting things, Michael, has been we live in the wake of that renaissance, and now we are sort of trying to make an appraisal. And some of us cannot make heads or tails regarding their positions on emancipation, on liberation, on Marxism, on socialism. And they have, in fact, been, I think, so influential that a lot of French thought has really shaped the meaning of the left globally, particularly in the West, but also globally. And so part of what we want to do is sort of talk about that legacy in a way. And this draws me to my first question for you, which is, in today's academia, as you see it, how would you diagnose or maybe assess that precise legacy of French theory? Are we still living in the wake of it? Is it waning? And if it is waning, why might that be the case?
The way that I would put it is that the legacy of that French philosophical moment is in many ways omnipresent, is all over the place in American academia, and yet at the same time oddly diminished. It seems to me that someone like Foucault in particular is more read, more assigned, more cited than ever. I do think it quickly becomes. I do think that the other generations, the other figures of that generation, are far less cited than him, but are certainly present. Foucault remains, I think, the overwhelmingly dominant figure. But at the same time, I would say that compared to moments that I remember in the 1980s and 1990s, the philosophical discussion of the significance of that generation of French thought has significantly tapered off. And so we find ourselves in a situation, if I can put it a little bit critically, where it seems like these thinkers have, or at least some thinkers from that generation, again, particularly Foucault, have achieved something close to canonical status, which is ironic, while at the same time being only superficially understood, in my view. So we certainly see Foucault as, students certainly have heard of Foucault. They are assigned Foucault in multiple classes. I know that in France, which I keep up with quite a bit, Foucault, is new editions of his work regularly come out. I sometimes say that there's a way in which Foucault kind of has the productivity of someone like Jimi Hendrix, in the sense that they both sort of seem to be particularly prolific post-death. And I mean, the whole sort of story of this sort of new wave of Foucault material that we got with the publication of Foucault's lectures over the past 20 years is a case in point. But Foucault is, for example, in France, assigned in this exam called the agrégation, which is a prestigious exam required to get certain teaching positions in France. And so again, he has this sort of quasi-canonical status. But I remember in the 1980s, when I was in college and soon thereafter, that there were considerable discussions about what the sort of deeper philosophical agenda was of that generation. And then, of course, there's the question of how exactly we are to refer to it. It's sometimes called French theory, sometimes postmodernism, sometimes post-structuralism, and other names beyond that. But, sort of questions about, the status of the subject and subjectivity in that thought were very important to understanding it. The whole polemic that thinkers like Foucault and others of his generation launched against the idea of humanism, which was so critical to an earlier generation of thought, particularly the existentialists of the 1950s, was an important issue. And then there were many other discussions about, what is the status of language, what is the status of narrative, and so on in the humanities. And my sense is that those bigger questions that sort of accompanied the arrival of French theory into the American Academy really have lost their traction and are not particularly discussed. And I think that at least part of the issue is that the real sort of legacy or imprint of that generation of French thought has become its various political permutations. And many of these overlap with the very controversial question of identity politics too. So some of the contexts in which Foucault might be frequently discussed these days could be sort of in the context of thinking about post-colonial theory, or conceptions of gender, or queer theory, or things like that. But some of those concepts themselves are already starting to be a bit dated as well. But it seems to me that it's really sort of mainly in that context that one sees the legacy of that generation, which does miss something about that sort of original kind of moment of American reception of postmodernism, which was very philosophical. One of the things that stood out to me, if I can sort of point this out, at the time, was the way in which so many academic disciplines had to sort of acquire a certain kind of philosophical sophistication in order to be able to grapple with those thoughts. I mean, that's very sort of evident in my field of history, but it was also true of English, political theory, and other fields. To the point that there were certain thinkers and philosophers that had become part of the vernacular in a way of certain humanistic disciplines that were not particularly read in philosophy departments, which were often analytical at that time. And I also just think that that things like the culture that came with that moment is something that we tend to forget. That there was a kind of element of sort of popular postmodernism, if you will, in American culture in the 80s and 90s, associated with film, music, art, and definitely literature. By the way, that if anything was probably the key art that was associated with postmodernism, and those attitudes were sort of very kind of bound up with what people thought about Foucault and other such thinkers. And again, I find that sort of element of the reception of those thinkers has just kind of vanished, it seems to me. So again, the overall way that I see it is that there's a way in which many of these thinkers and some of the ideas associated with them have kind of become entrenched in American academic life. Even at the same time that there's almost something verging on kind of illiteracy about the broader philosophical agenda associated with them.
Yeah, I mean, I feel as if there's a political undercurrent here of 68, which is a very interesting moment in the world. People talk about 68 and they think it is like an earthquake that only happened in France. Really, it's Latin America had a huge series of uprisings that were probably more politically consequential than even what happened in Paris. But what I think is significant about the 68 question is the way that a new theory of liberation beyond the Marxist theory of liberation was proposed. And this kind of gets to the latter point that you just raised and will eventually tee us up to talk about Michel Clouscard, who is a figure at the center of French philosophy. We'll introduce him in a moment. But one of the things that I've been very drawn to and curious about, having studied with Alain Badiou, for example, is this recasting of the Marxist tradition. And this draws me to Foucault and a question I have about that, because I feel as if when you say that a lot of folks are less informed regarding the specificities of the context in which a thinker like Foucault is grappling with 68, with the question of French Maoism, but also with the idea of what we call the new philosophers, who are even more reactionary against Marxism. Some of them are former Maoists. This introduces us to this very strange, almost quasi-horseshoe theory, which we see with Trotskyists becoming neocons in a way, right? Which is a side point, but it does become important to identify Foucault's historical context as well as his generation of his concepts. So, for example, you write a lot about how once the neoliberal reforms really start to set in the early 70s, going off the gold standard with Nixon, the economic shocks that bring about what would become Thatcherism and Reaganism and the new regime of austerity and the decompartmentalization of the welfare state, that Foucault actually looks at these changes. And I want to invite you to say something about that in a way which is aiming to obliterate the Marxist tradition. And I don't think that we should be too shy when we say that, because I think that a lot of leftists that are attached to Foucault, they want to say, well, what about his little Maoist period? What about the fact that we can take maybe his reactionary liberalism and still use it? To which I respond, maybe, but first let's get the context right. So could you give us a bit of an overview of this debate, what its stakes are, maybe an articulation of the two sides of the debate, if it is reducible to that, and where you fall on it?
Great question. So first of all, I just want to be clear about, in a sense, kind of what the textual references of the debate are. If viewers, and I encourage them to do so, wish to read up on this themselves, that's important. So I actually alluded briefly a moment ago to the fact that since Foucault's death in 1984, and really starting in the late 90s, Foucault's lectures have been published. And to sort of say what those are, Foucault, as of 1970, had a position that was considered to be one of the most prestigious in the French Academy. But it's also a somewhat odd position because in a certain way, it is at least slightly outside the academy. He was a professor on the history of systems of thought, I think it was called, at this institution called the Collège de France, where essentially he had no students, and the requirement for being one is elected to that position, and the only sort of public requirement is that you have to give a certain number of public lectures each year. There's a few other requirements, but that's sort of the main thing. So really from 1970 until his death in 1984, give or take a few years when he didn't teach, he gave an annual series of lectures, and they're whatever one thinks about Foucault, they're remarkably coherent, and if you publish each one as a volume, then it forms a really quite coherent book. So all of those have now been published, and specifically on the question of Foucault's relationship to liberalism and neoliberalism, the real question concerns primarily the lectures that he delivered in 1979, which has the kind of obscure and very Foucaultian title, The Birth of Biopolitics, but in which he really gave a series of lectures about liberalism, liberal political thought, and the liberal approach to government, which he called liberal governmentality. He actually specifically talks about American traditions of neoliberalism, including people like Milton Friedman. He talks about the Austrian and particularly German tradition, this post-war movement called Ordo liberalism that actually played an important role in the post-war German economic miracle, as well as certain French traditions of liberalism. It's important to remember that those exist. And so that the real question about Foucault's relationship to neoliberalism concerns the interpretation, I would say, of the 1979 texts. And I guess you could say that there are, and other materials get thrown into that, but the centerpiece is really those lectures. And I guess the stake of it is really of the debate is there a moment when Michel Foucault, who, as you said, is seen as this kind of new thinker of political emancipation, who on the one hand seems to be very critical of aspects of Marxist thought, but tries to invent a leftist emancipatory politics on new philosophical grounds, does he kind of blink when actually at a quite early stage of when the Western world seems to be moving in a neoliberal direction, with Thatcher's election and Reagan's election being sort of perhaps the two most important points, and actually use his philosophical principles to provide a kind of philosophical justification for neoliberalism, or at least kind of give it a pass. And so the question is really fundamentally about, is Foucault a philosopher of the left? And also on that basis, how useful is he for those who might wish to invoke him to achieve any number of political goals in the present? And I guess I would say that that the position that I defended in an article that I believe was published in 2009, called Liberalism Without Humanism, Foucault and the Free Market Creed, and that was also published in a volume about this matter. My position is that essentially Foucault offers a kind of strategic endorsement of neoliberalism in the 1979 lectures. I believe that my position is not that Foucault became a neoliberal, although I perhaps come close to saying something like that. But rather to argue that there is something about that late 70s moment that made him need to sort of present neoliberalism in a surprisingly positive light, and in a way that I presume surprised his audiences. In a nutshell, it seems to me that the real issue for Foucault was a debate within the left, that he's actually fundamentally less concerned with providing philosophical resources to free marketeers on the right than he is with trying to kind of settle scores with people he disagrees with on the left. And there's a big debate within French socialism around this time concerning its kind of statist versus non-statist elements. And I'll sort of spare you, unless we need to get into the sort of the details of Socialist Party politics in the 1970s, but it is something of a big debate. And my argument is that Foucault was really trying to align himself with this non-statist pro-civil society current within French socialism that actually later or that actually assumed the name of the so-called second left. The second left was the sort of non-statist element. The first left was allegedly the sort of more statist element, and that talking about a form of political thought that believed that there were ways of regulating society, or that society had regulatory capacities that did not rely primarily on the coercive powers of the state, was at least one way of doing that. I also think it's very interesting to sort of I also think that one of the things that Foucault found interesting about certain forms of neoliberalism is that they resonated with some of the philosophical points that he had made in his work from the 1960s, particularly this very important but very difficult to understand element of Foucault's work, which is his critique of so-called humanism. I mean, this is a very difficult issue, and I don't even claim to fully understand it, even though I've been thinking about it for years. I think one of the murkiest aspects of Foucault's thought is this critique of humanism. But in a nutshell, Foucault believes that humanism should not be the philosophical basis for all thought, that it's a historically specific and in many ways philosophically and politically problematic moment, and in part because of assumptions that it makes about human nature. And one of the things that intrigues him about certain forms of free market, neoliberal thought, is that it relies on a very sort of thin conception of human nature. He's intrigued, for example, that certain neoliberals who were thinking about how to manage things like crime and the regulation of illegal drugs and things like that, can actually just kind of dispense with any notion of criminality or the idea of a criminal. And Foucault had long been sort of fascinated with, the way that that this kind of humanist tradition of thought sort of was kind of very sort of intent especially in the late 19th century in trying to kind of define the type of human being that the criminal was. And neoliberalism just kind of dispenses with that. If you think that people are just fundamentally motivated by incentives of various kinds, and the question is how those incentives play off one another, then you can dispense with any notion of the criminal. And I think there's something that Foucault finds fascinating and bluntly quite appealing about that. So those are some of the key elements of my argument about how there is, I mean, if I can use a sort of, somewhat fancy term associated with the German sociologist Max Weber, I think there's elective affinities between Foucault's philosophical and political concerns and neoliberalism, and that allows this kind of convergence to occur. And at least I hope that I've said that this is something short of actually kind of a conversion to neoliberalism, but it's a convergence, if it's not a convergent. And I guess the sort of opposition to that is, no, that's not true, and it sort of, I think it sort of sees that view would sort of read Foucault's 1979 lectures as being much more sort of implicitly critical of neoliberalism. It would sort of point out that it's actually a very sort of brief and passing moment in Foucault's thought, which is true. Foucault does not write a big book about any of this, and he quickly gets onto other subjects, particularly his history of sexuality. And I also think that many of these people would place much greater priority on Foucault's engagements and activism in the early 70s, when indeed he kind of flirts with Marxism and Marxist categories. There's something that a lot of people are familiar with is this famous exchange that he has in Holland, and I believe in 1970 with Noam Chomsky, which is a crucial moment in Foucault's career because it's really the very, very beginning of his the moment when he starts to think seriously about power and politics. Some people would say he always has been. I'm not sure I would agree with that. I think that changes significantly in the late 60s and in 1970. But, he in that interview, he quotes Mao Zedong. He uses very casually terms like the bourgeoisie and the working class. And I really do think that he dispenses with those terms later. But I think the position that is unconvinced by his convergence with neoliberalism would place much more priority on his clear comfort with those terms at an earlier point, which I don't dispute. It is clear that at that moment he is intrigued by aspects of Marxism. I think there's a big, I don't know if you want to get into this, and it might be of interest to your viewers, but I'll stop right now. And if you want to press me, we can take it. But I mean, is the bigger question of like, what's the big picture question about Foucault's relationship to Marxism? I mean, I am deeply convinced that it's a mistake to think of Foucault as a Marxist and even less as a communist, but that's a bigger issue.
Yeah, great. Well, I mean, there's I don't know who said it, but there's a phrase that Michel Foucault is the last weapon the bourgeoisie has been capable of mustering in its attempt to preserve its class power.
Do you remember who said that? But so that was Sartre in the mid 60s in his critique of the Order of Things, the famous 1966 book. And Foucault had a good sort of comeback to that, which is basically poor bourgeoisie. I pity the bourgeoisie if the only rampart they have to defend themselves is my work. So, but that was a critique by Sartre, if I'm not mistaken.
Understood. Yeah, I guess I'll just share my own reservations regarding Michel Foucault's work, despite the richness that I find in his work. I mean, Madness and Civilization is full of so many fascinating nuggets of and historical anecdotes and the wider framework that he develops in Discipline and Punish. You get this imagery of systems of power in history, but my problem is the revolutionary conjuncture and the revolutionary subject is missing in his wider theory of the epistemes of history, which I take to be a Nietzschean move. Just for listeners, I interviewed Jan Raymond, who has written an incredible book on Deleuze and Foucault's Nietzscheanism and the philosophical problems that brings about. The other domain of Foucauldianism that I struggle with is something that I think the left, where his influence has been very paramount, is there is a tendency for Foucault's theory of power to result in what you might call perhaps a kind of unrigorous or maybe even hyperbolic conception of power. I'm thinking here of his preface to Anti-Oedipus
Hmm.
on the Guide to Non-Fascist Living,
Right.
where the outcome of Foucault's conception of fascism really has been quite damaging in its total scope, right? Meaning that if you adopt that perspective, my contention, and I want your take on this, would be that you lose the legibility of distinction to qualify right wing ideology. In part, also because the whole category of ideology is also thrown into suspicion. So there's
Agreed.
this renaissance, but the renaissance of Foucault and Deleuze and French theory is very taking categories out, root and branch, and so I guess that's the sort of stakes, right? So I see it more than just the 79 lecture. I think one can make a plausible argument that maybe Sartre was onto something here. And Sartre, by the way, has never been a big Nietzschean, in
Agreed.
fact. Um, what would you say to those more general concerns? And again, I'm not going to be of the view that bourgeois thought or reactionary thought has no place in Marxist. No, I'm not taking that position. I'm rather saying that we should be clear on Foucault's agenda, but also, his political worldview and how that has developed his concepts. So I agree with you, and I appreciate you laying that out. But what would you say to some of these more kind of more broad or like appraisals that say, no, actually, Foucault's thought is maybe more fundamentally a bit more compromised for a leftist project?
I completely agree, and I'm sort of primarily intervening here as a someone who writes about Foucault. I'm going to sort of take a pass right now on sort of the deeper political issues, but I think your characterization of Foucault's position is completely accurate. And to me, that has to be seen as kind of part of the broader background to the interest that he takes in liberalism in that period. Is that there was already kind of a multi-level critique of Marx and Marxism. And I guess the way that I see it is that there's kind of like several levels at which Foucault is kind of critiquing that tradition. I mean, there is in some cases a critique of Karl Marx himself, but I actually think that is the point at which he's least critical, because the philosophical tradition in which he's trained strongly emphasizes a kind of very sort of dense reading of Hegel. Jean Hippolyte, his one of his thesis advisors, I think is very crucial. And I don't know if you know this, but there's Foucault's 1949 kind of almost like master's thesis or even senior thesis has now been published. I worked a little bit on that, and it's on the theme of sort of Kant and Hegel and their conception of transcendental thought. But there's little sort of moments where Marx kind of comes in, and there's a Foucault has respect for and takes seriously Marx as a thinker, even if there are also sort of key moments in which he's very critical. I think he's much more critical of Marxism, and as for communism, I mean, there are moments when Foucault is almost knee-jerk in his hostility to the communist tradition. The fact that he was briefly in the party in the 1950s, notwithstanding. So I think all that has to be taken seriously. I think his and just a couple things I would sort of in kind of no particular order add to your characterization, which again I think is completely accurate of his sort of distance from Marxism. Is I think that I think that at the moment in the 1970s when Foucault really starts to become this philosopher of power, and which is associated with the philosophical project that he calls genealogy, which is different from the earlier project of the 1960s called archaeology. And there's a whole debate about how those two relate. But when he really starts to focus on the question of power, I actually think that there's an interesting way in which Foucault sort of sees his conception of power as being a form of materialism, but it's very, very much not a materialism in the Marxist sense. Namely, it is very much not focused on production, economic systems, the economic foundation of society. I think Foucault, I very sort of passionately, in a way, kind of has this vision of the world as being sort of fundamentally shaped by power relations in a profoundly kind of tangible sense. That's one of the reasons why he becomes so, interested in and obsessed with things like the body, which becomes a real sort of, marker of his kind of philosophical style, because the body, bears the imprint of power relations, and it's almost kind of like he rejects the idea that you can ever sort of think about politics outside this quite sort of tangible understanding of power relations, which are always relations. That's a crucial part of it. And one of the reasons, for example, why he is almost kind of exasperated with people who want to talk about the state, because the state to him, in a way that almost has a sort of Marxist character in its materialism. The state for Marx is the ultimate abstraction, right? What's the Nietzschean quote? The coldest of cold monsters, or whatever, so just as kind of like in Marxism, there's a kind of exasperation with abstract philosophical concepts from the standpoint of focusing on the material production of life. In Foucault, this sort of focus on the tangibility of power relations, makes him say, why are we talking about these abstractions like the state, when what really matters is sort of seeing how, in this kind of retail, at this kind of retail level, power is sort of playing out. But I do think that means that like, I don't think we should see that materialism as a kind of, sort of open door to sort of for a reconciliation between the two. I think it's a hostile position to Marx's conception. The other thing I would just say is capitalism. It's not completely absent from Marx's thought. I mean, from Foucault's thought. That there's kind of a weird sort of reference to it in Madness and Civilization and moments in the first volume of the History of Sexuality, where he references it. But it does and people who long for that reconciliation between Marx and Foucault will sort of cling to those passages. But in my view, it just does no explanatory work. That's what it means to be a Marxist, is to sort of, to sort of take the idea of capitalism seriously. And just to conclude just on one point, this one little, I wrote something about this in a kind of obscure article, but this might interest your viewers. There's this interesting moment where Foucault gets a little bit defensive about the attacks of Marxists against him. And he says, I actually really am a Marxist. However, I am a Marxist of Capital Volume 2. And he says this in several interviews. And his argument is that, and there's two things that are interesting about this. First of all, he's trying to say, I'm not interested in the long metaphysical explanations of how labor is, becomes capital in the early parts of the first volume. I'm interested in these moments where Marx talks about how factories are organized and things like that.
Right.
So,
which is also in volume 1.
It's a weird argument. Like, what does it mean to be a Marxist of volume 2? And then the other thing is Foucault is very, very conscientious about his philosophical references, but this one he just gets wrong because it's actually not in volume 2. Volume 2 is about the circulation of
Right.
a capital.
It's in volume 1.
He really
Yeah.
means the sort of later parts of volume 1. And
Right.
so I think it's
Right.
interesting that like Foucault's
On the section on the working day. Right.
I think it's that one. Yeah, I'll
Right. Which
trust you on
was
that. But
really, I mean, what's very
it's
ironic
interesting
about
that that's where, you know, if there's a moment where he's going to make a philosophical or, you know, misquote someone, it's
Yeah.
significant that it's on Marx, I think.
Well, it's very ironic because
Yeah.
the anti-communist sentiment against the French Communist Party of the time, I mean, who was the inspiration in volume 1 that Marx is building off of? It's building off of the condition of the working class in England by Engels.
Right.
And quote unquote Engelsian Marxism is probably the devil, not the devil, but it's sort of one of his main antagonists in Marxism. So that is a very strange, but it would make sense because he's interested in this notion of discipline. So the worker is subordinated to his particular theory of discipline, which you do talk about in 79. Discipline shifts, and so I think the takeaway here, and I want to move now to introduce Michel Clouscard, so we're going to make a pivot, but perhaps the takeaway is that, you know, Foucauldianism has given us this repertoire, this kind of toolbox of concepts that have been very alluring to academia, to the left. I would claim also to the avant-garde and to let's call it like the libertine tradition. I'm not sure that we have a libertine tradition as active as we did in the 20th century. But, you know, it kind of results in a type of liberal libertarianism. And I feel that to connect that to your original point when we started the interview, it's perhaps precisely that toolbox that needs to be reassessed in a comradely way, and, you know, not in a way that is fundamentally dismissive, because without question, Foucault is a brilliant philosopher. Sure. So it might be interesting at this point for us to introduce Michel Clouscard. You have recently written a piece in Compact magazine on Clouscard, where you're really looking at his book on the theory of seduction in late capitalism, which is somewhat of a Baudrillardian thesis. Jean Baudrillard has written quite a lot about this, although these two French thinkers are very different from one another. I've already given, as I mentioned with Monville, a great, I think, introductory overview to Clouscard's major work, so we don't need to necessarily do that. But let us begin, Michael, with just like, you know, what about Clouscard appealed to you first? I think you are doing some work on. Are you working on translating any of his works, or are you really more writing about his works?
Just writing, and I'm not an expert. This may be a one-off thing, but I was interested in him, so I wrote that article.
Yeah. So tell us like what is appealing about. I mean, I could spend a long time telling you about why I like Clouscard, but I want to start with your take first.
So I think it is. I think my interest is brazenly presentist and contemporary. Which is a good starting point, but in and of itself is not sufficient to really understand a thinker. He doesn't belong to the too distant past, but you know, he's someone whose sort of heyday was the 1970s and 80s, much like Foucault. And I think that the real and what I mean by contemporary relevance is the fact that I think that he is a fierce critic of certain trends that he sees in the political left, and he makes that critique as someone who very much sees himself as being on the left, and bluntly, I think that at a time when you know, there are many people who are concerned about the direction of the left in the United States and France and elsewhere. You know, the way that it really sort of, the left seems to have to a significant extent sort of abandoned its prior sort of basis in the working class and focus on economic issues, and it has instead become a party of sort of educated professionals focusing much more on identity issues, and at the same time being quite favorable in many ways to to free market liberalism or neoliberalism. I think that Clouscard is interesting because he's prescient, because he's already kind of seen some of those trends in at a much earlier period, and I really think that's actually also the sort of focus of his work. I want to be absolutely clear that I don't think that Clouscard is exactly talking about the same situation or talking about the same issues as people who are talking about this question at present are, but I certainly think that he's relevant to it. So, and just to be clear, you've mentioned the famous Clouscard phrase, probably the thing that he's best known for, this idea of liberal-libertarianism.
Right.
In other words, the notion that sort of what the left is or has become is a sort of ideology that is largely kind of favorable to capitalism and free market ideas, but blends into those a defense of a kind of lifestyles of sort of personal emancipation, connected to the consumer culture of the 20th century, connected to a certain kind of connected to the sexual revolution, and sort of all the values that come out of that. So I think that's sort of that's really the heart of his thought, as I understand it.
Well, I think the heart, I agree. The heart of his thought, I talked with Émeric Monville on this, is really in a way a kind of continuation of a historical study of the historical evolution of the bourgeoisie. And to the extent that he's a critic of French theory, he's a critic of the superstructure, in a Marxist sense, of the bourgeois intellectual class, which are his peers, right? And so in that sense, he's doing something very close to what Marx is doing against Feuerbach in the German ideology and Marx's critique of the young Hegelians. Really? I mean, really, it really is close. And in other words, it's ideology critique. But in his Seduction of Capitalism text, and this is one of the reasons why this book was popular, he's talking about this kind of almost quasi-anthropological theory of how we get initiated into consumer capitalism, and he's developing also a theory of how we become alienated there. But what's different in Clouscard's analysis of late capitalism is that he makes a strong claim, and this is a very powerful claim, that there is a kind of erasure of the working class subject in late capitalism. And that claim goes so strongly against what Foucault said in 1977, where it's like he said, to paraphrase, we no longer have bourgeoisie versus proletariat. You may remember this quote.
Yeah.
Right? And that goes back to the theory of power. Clouscard is saying, actually, no, we cannot neglect the class foundations of power. So talk about Clouscard maybe as a critic of his class. He is a very fascinating figure, and Dominique Pagani, a living French philosopher who is his comrade, has a wonderful YouTube page that I recommend people check out, introductions to Clouscard, things of this nature. But maybe you could say something about how Clouscard inserts himself in these live wire debates about 68, about post-structuralism. He has written quite a lot against Lacan. He is very critical of Lacan's whole, and I myself am pretty much a kind of Lacanian, because I see, by the way, as a side point, I actually see Lacan a bit like Freud, where it's sort of like what Lacan and Freud and psychoanalysis is talking about is not necessarily like reducible to like the right or the left. No, it's up to us to actually interrogate that as a discourse. So that's a side point. Because, for example, he has a fascinating piece about the changing composition of fascism and how Freudian Marxists completely missed the mark in their understanding of fascism, which is, I mentioned that earlier. It's called neo-fascism and the ideology of
Yeah.
desire.
Yep.
And we're trying to translate that. So maybe you could just say a few things about Clouscard's
It's
sort
this
of,
one.
yeah, Delga editions, which
Yeah,
is
that's right.
Pagani's
Oh, okay.
publication. And they are, by the way, Clouscard was a strong critic of Althusser. He was a strong member of the PCF, the French Communist Party. And he was, I think, for a moment, certainly one of the top communist philosophers of the party, right? Let's keep in mind that the 68 philosophers rejected the party. And in a tragic case, it was actually the French Communist Party that sort of put a halt to some of the 68 protests. So we're talking about a true clash, intellectual clash here between Marxism and 68 thought, perhaps. What is Clouscard's, what is he saying about this?
So, first of all, I definitely think that he is. I just want to sort of underline your point about his critique of those who think that leftist and emancipatory thought can dispense with a grounding in the working class. I think that that is absolutely a foundation of his thought. And in the book that you just mentioned, Neo-Fascism and the Ideology of Desire, one of the things that he specifically associates with the 68 ideology, which he calls the ideology of desire, because he thinks the question of sexual desire has sort of become the new radical perspective that these thinkers embrace. And he has in mind here some very different philosophical traditions, because he both is kind of referring to someone like Herbert Marcuse, who kind of is if I can put it this way, a kind of, Frankfurt School light kind of take on this issue, and which is fundamentally about the argument that capitalism represses sexual desire. So if you want to free sexual desire and be sexually emancipated, you also have to get rid of capitalism. So, Clouscard is definitely attacking that, but he's also attacking people like Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, particularly Deleuze and Guattari's famous Anti-Oedipus, which has this whole sort of complex theory about desire as production, and the real sort of foundation of society. And those people are actually quite critical of Marcuse, but sort of Clouscard sort of lumps them together. But just to get back to the key point, Clouscard is critical of those of all of these kind of currents of European 68 thought, on the grounds that they basically conclude that the working class has ceased to be revolutionary, and that what they're talking about is a kind of significant sociological phenomenon, which is that with the development of the post-war society, and a combination of sort of significant economic growth and the development of consumerism, that the question of basically economic hardship, which had really sort of been central to thinking about working class issues, had been significantly put aside. If workers now in France and elsewhere look like Archie Bunker's family on All in the Family, then we're dealing with a fundamentally different kind of working class. And so consequently, the sort of 68 thinkers say, well, where do you find radicalism in society? And it's with marginal groups. So this could be students. This could be, insofar as students often thought of themselves as kind of facing a form of hardship in the late 1960s for a variety of reasons. This could be sort of bohemian sort of types, people who live out the kind of outside the constraints of bourgeois society. And it certainly was racial minorities, of course, but also, sometimes even sort of kind of, criminal or sort of marginal elements were, something like what Marx once called the lumpen proletariat, were also seen as kind of potential sources of radicalism. And Clouscard can't stand this, right? Clouscard's argument that this kind of rejection of the working class and sort of an embrace of these kind of, sort of marginal elements has nothing at all to do with a broader kind of social emancipation and or a critique of capitalism. The thing that interested me when I actually sat down and started reading Clouscard, which I had not done until a few months ago, just to write that piece. And again, I'm not an expert. I'm just someone who's kind of sort of tried him out for size, as it were, is how much it fundamentally is, his work is fundamentally a critique of intellectuals, and a critique of the sociology of intellectuals. So that's something that I don't know, and I don't feel like I know him well enough to sort of overtly disagree with you about sort of saying that he's a critique of ideology, because part of me would be tempted to say, however, that even more fundamentally than a critic of ideology, he is a critique of he is a critic of the cultural politics of intellectuals. And the word that really sort of stood out to me as I was reading his text, and it stood out to me because it's a unusual word, I think, to find in this kind of literature, both Marxist literature and in the sort of broader kind of moment that he's a part of, the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And it's a difficult word to translate, but it's this word mondanité, would be the noun. Mondain is the adjective. And what it really sort of refers to is the high society insofar as it has great cultural cachet. So to me, sort of like the first thing that would come to mind is sort of the world that Marcel Proust describes in his famous full work that I'm blanking on the title of right now, but Remembrance of Things Past.
Yeah.
In which you have these sort of impressive, very cultured people who are always kind of meeting in salons and discussing ideas, but also sort of embracing unconventional kind of opinions. They're all sleeping with each other and sort of things like this. Maybe the sort of, the Bloomsbury group in
Right.
in Britain would be sort of a good kind of example of this. Also, in other words, people who sort of combine significant social status, maybe not the wealthiest people in society, but people who have come from money, but who are also regarded as culturally avant-garde and have a kind of avant-garde lifestyle as well. And so that's what the word mondain mean. In the article that I wrote, I translated it as hipster because I couldn't think of anything better, but it certainly does it the power of Clouscard's use of it is that, if sort of the kind of heyday of the word mondain in a French context would be, I don't know, sort of roughly maybe the 18th and the 19th centuries, with a little bit before, a little bit after, Clouscard applies it really sort of to the entire history of the development of the bourgeoisie, as you describe, finding sort of moments of it in the Middle Ages. He talks about sort of court culture as being sort of the first kind of example of this sort of proto-hipster sort of milieu. And he is certainly saying that it is the main way, I believe, that we should interpret the philosophical positions of avant-garde intellectuals in the 60s and 70s, and so the argument sort of really becomes that it to me, it's not sort of necessarily a kind of first order critique of the ideology of desire, as he calls it, itself, but it's a critique of the way in which a certain class of bourgeois intellectuals uses that kind of critique to acquire cultural status. And to me, that is the kind of the most sort of striking thing. And also, if I can just sort of throw this in, I spoke to a very good scholar named Sylvain Bourgois, who hasn't unfortunately published a biography of Clouscard, but he should, because he's done some wonderful research on his life, and he gave me some interesting information about him. But it's there's something personal in this critique about for Clouscard also. You say that it's and at some level it's true that this is kind of, he's critiquing his own milieu, and at a certain point that's true. At a certain point,
Sure.
he's a civil servant who's as most teachers are in France, who's a university philosophy professor. He does a lot of his career at the University of Poitiers, but he is someone who comes from this kind of working class and sort of quite sort of almost and rural and provincial background, and to me, one of the things that's intriguingly powerful about Clouscard is what he's able to do with class resentment.
Right.
And that's not sort of necessarily kind of a popular position, to sort of say, well, you should take your class resentment and run with it and build a kind of philosophical sort of system on it. But I actually think one of the intriguing things about him is that in a certain way, that's precisely what what he does. And he hates everybody. By all accounts, he's a very sort of charming, lovely man. I've only found, there's this one video of him from this French TV show in the 1980s that I watched, so I don't have a real sort of sense of it. But when you read his writing, it's like every intellectual in French history in some ways. I'm not sure who would not sort of fit into this category.
Yeah.
Comes to embody a certain kind of bourgeois aspiration for mondanité, for this kind of hipster cultural status. That's my interpretation. And again, this is where I'm not
sure,
no. But that was a big takeaway for me.
No, for me, he is a Marxist, and so much so when I said ideology, again, I'm thinking of that term in such a way where we say, okay, he has developed a conception or the capacity in his book on Freudian Marxism to kind of do something that a lot of scholars will discard the book because what he does. But what he does is he is capable of fusing Deleuze and Guattari with Marcuse, even though Deleuze technically, in a highly technical way, rejects Freudian Marxism.
Sure.
For Clouscard, what matters is that both Marcuse and Deleuze and Guattari are rejecting core Marxist categories. When you talk about economic immiseration, I was just reading a lecture around the time of 73 by Deleuze, and he says one of our most important breaks with Marxism is that we reject the category of need fundamentally, and we replace it with desire, right? Now, Clouscard then takes this notion, and he argues that the Lacanian theory of the signifier enters into a new discourse and new vernacular in which the what you're calling the hipster discourse and so on has a new form of circulation, which is segregative to working class subjects. And at worst, and I mean at worst, and we still see this to this day, I think this is one of the most pernicious legacies of this broader tendency of Freudian Marxism and French theory, because if you don't have those, if you don't have that linguistic capacity for whatever reasons, you could quite be eligible to be perhaps like a fascist or to be reactionary. So that's what really interests me, is this strong reappraisal of this system of thought that I was raised to admire very, very deeply. So
Agreed.
reading Clouscard was a revelation for me on that level, and then also because I see his work as a serious effort to bring back the political Marx in a strong, strong way. And again, my interview with Monville gets into this in much more depth, and I plan to write more on Clouscard myself. So at the same time, I want to now talk about what we might call the Christopher Lasch effect of Clouscard. Now, you and I have discussed this, and I think it's worth being made public. A lot of left-wing thinkers are a bit hesitant to bring Clouscard to an Anglo-American audience, and there's a very particular reason for that. And there's a very strange Alain Soral, this very idiosyncratic conspiracy theorist, cites Clouscard as one of his motivations and influence of his thought. He's kind of like I guess he's kind of like a French Alex Jones, but maybe a little bit more intellectual, if that's the right way. He's deeply anti-Semitic.
Yeah, fair enough. And
Right.
I think something along those lines. He's also, and I don't know a ton about him, but he is certainly, as I understand it, politically aligned with, the National
Right.
Rally, which is the former National Front,
Right.
so which raises the whole question about the proper way to characterize that movement. But he, Alain Soral is definitely, tied to populist right or far
Right.
right politics.
So, which is itself a tragedy, because in a way we know that the base of the French Communist Party, some perhaps significant number of those working class French citizens got funneled into the right.
Indeed.
And so how do you face that reality? This goes back to the question of the role of intellectuals to face that reality of the working class in its condition at this moment. And I don't think we should flee from that struggle, in my view. And that's why Clouscard is courageous, because he's not gonna do that. But here's the thing: nor is he ever going to endorse some far right thing. You see my point? So
Right.
there's a certain principled position there. Now,
he came out. I don't know if you know this, but there's towards the end of his life, he did write a sort of short letter to L'Humanité, which is still the Communist Party newspaper, in which Clouscard was very clear that, I don't agree with Sorel. So
that's very important. Yeah. Well, I think it was his book. It's a very interesting book. It's a quote from Hegel, where Hegel once said that civil society is like the great beast, and that he gave it that title. It's a book on civil society in our present.
Yeah.
And I believe that the Sorel guy is really fond of this particular work.
I see.
So, okay, now Lasch. Why do I say Lasch effect? Well, I say Lasch effect because Lasch also criticized Freudian Marxism in similar ways, understood that a left without the working class is going to lose its compass. And now in our moment of ideological disarray, we need to sort of prepare for that debate that we'll inevitably have when we introduce thinkers that are going to be raising these questions. So that's what I would say to leftists that are kind of too hesitant to bring the Clouscard debate out. I think it should be brought out. What would you say to that? And obviously you would agree, I imagine. But what would you say? I mean, don't you think that, especially now with the second Trump period, this is the time to begin to really interrogate this question?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what my I agree, and in some sense, I agree that what you've just described is really and should be seen as basically the most important political question of the present. I mean, I'm not exaggerating too much in saying that it's precisely those kinds of concerns that have led me to people like Clouscard and in the past few years to carefully read Christopher Lasch too. I guess my sort of, simple position is that I think that, I think that the Lasch and Clouscard critique draws blood. I think it gets something correct about our current moment, about the this sort of strange way in which the left has really sort of become the party of to use Marx's phrase, sort of bourgeois intellectuals, and the right has done much better at being a working class party, and that somehow the issue of neoliberalism has played a sort of crucial role in that sort of shift. So I guess I'm struggling to sort of draw a really consequential conclusion other than just saying that I agree. But here's one of the things that I think is really important about these thinkers is I think that, and I think that one step that's of course crucial in all this is that people on the left, and also just simply people who are intellectuals, who frequently just kind of the way things work now are going to be more left identifying, need to engage in self-critique. I think that there is a tendency of academics, especially in the humanities, to think that ideology is what other people think, whether they use that term or not, in some kind of informed way. But they still sort of have that idea that that somehow that they are the educated class that sort of see things lucidly and objectively, and whereas it's other people who sort of have kind of unreconstructed views and are unable to see how their prejudices inform their actions and so on. Whereas I think it is absolutely true that the intellectuals, the academics, and so on do the same thing, and that they have a very difficult time sort of seeing the way in which the causes that they embrace, the ideas that have become commonplace to them, are somehow tied to their professional status and even their broader place in society, and dare I say their sort of class identity. And I think that people like Lasch and Clouscard help you see that. I think that and just to sort of state the sort of blatantly obvious, I don't know much about your background. I'm certainly not working class and don't claim to be. But so I think that one thing that that is kind of is crucial about this sort of moment that we find ourselves in is that there is an enormous need for a kind of self-critique of the intellectuals and professional class, and I think that that's what you get from Clouscard. I mean, a sort of slightly kind of masochistic pleasure that you get from reading some of these kinds of people is when they talk about when Clouscard talks about sort of the this desperate need for people who have sort of academic status to also be regarded as sort of cool and attractive, and is like, you're like, I kind of recognize myself in that, right? And I think that is sort of an important part of what you have to offer, and that may not be, that's no call to barricades, right? That may not be get you very far, but I do think in our present moment something like that is necessary. I just from my daily life in a university environment, and I love my colleagues. I feel like I see this all the time. That there's we kind of roll our eyes at the at the sort of nutty MAGA and Trumpster sort of people, while we just sort of take for granted that somehow our position is the only sort of objective and virtuous one. And it's my hope that these kind of thinkers will help us wean us off of those kinds of really quite prejudiced views.
Yeah, I mean, brilliant. Well said. I feel perhaps one of the anxieties that people have upon reading a thinker like Clouscard is that the critique of liberalism is quite strong, perhaps so strong that it leaves the reader feeling, well, how can I cooperate and coexist with existing liberalism, given that it is so fundamentally compromised, right? And on the one hand, and then on the other hand, I think that the right, and I think we really see this in the second Trump period we're currently living through, has itself become a normalized, the center of what we mean by the right under Trump is actually pretty much like a far right expression in a technical sense.
Sure.
And so therefore, there is this type of, I would say, a paternalistic logic where the leftist or the Marxist feels like, well, we have to kind of cooperate with the Democrats because, God forbid, we allow Trumpism to devolve into something even more far right, right? And so naturally, what we talk about a lot on my program, Michael, is the necessity to develop a kind of socialist party and to reconnect with the American, Eugene Debs tradition, and to really push against the hegemony of the liberal center. So that's a separate thing. I want, in our concluding time, speaking of anti-liberalism, to just briefly introduce, and this will merit its own separate discussion, another French thinker that you work on. You have a forthcoming book on this figure. His name is Jean-Claude Michéa, and he's a extraordinarily singular voice, is still living, a communist critic of liberalism. His hero is George Orwell.
Right.
And
Christopher Lasch, by the way.
And Christopher Lasch. And Chris, I mean, I don't know if I mentioned this to you. I've interviewed Christopher Lasch's daughter on my show, and my first book was very much working with his work, and I'm planning to go up to Rochester to spend some time in his archives. So I'm something like a Laschian myself. And so when I first read The Realm of Lesser Evil, which is the book translated by Michel, I was sort of blown away at the autodidactic brilliance of this figure. And he's sort of marginal from the university, but he writes these essays that have a rich intellectual content, much more rich than most other current philosophy and theory. Sure. So when I say rich, I mean like extraordinarily rigorous in the references. What he has to say about Spinoza is deeply fascinating. How he recasts the history of Marxism is deeply fascinating and original, right? But he says things like, well, I'm not a formal academic, so I have the liberty not to footnote everything.
Right.
Okay, so if you accept that, you can actually read this and say like, oh my God, this is incredible material. So I get it. But like Lasch and Clouscard, he's extremely, well, I assume, controversial. Who is this Michéa figure? Why do you find him so useful? And tell us maybe about this new book you have with him.
Sure.
On him.
Sure. So the book is a collection of his writings. I've called it with a little bit of a spirit of provocation towards a conservative left. And it's a collection of excerpts from Michéa's writings, including the ones that you mentioned that I've translated. And this is done in cooperation with him and in collaboration. We also have a new interview with him in the book's conclusion. So, Jean-Claude Michéa is he actually, his career was as a high school philosophy teacher, which is a thing in France. Philosophy is taught in the final year of high school. And
you mean like unlike in America where you just have to do everything?
Right, that's right. Yeah, it's an interesting aspect of French educational culture, you know, that and it's been around for you know, at least since the 19th century. This idea of the last year, as they'll even call, like, instead of like 12th grade, you know, it's like philo is, or philosophy is sort of the name that's sometimes given this last year. Anyway, that's his career. So he was trained in as a philosopher, and he taught it for many years. He grew up in a communist milieu. It's actually very interesting that both of his parents were actually party members, and he sort of grew up in a kind of communist world. I just love this anecdote, but his dad was actually the sports reporter in the 40s and 50s for L'Humanité, which is the Communist Party newspaper, and he grew up in like public housing in Paris that was kind of tied to the party and so on. He no longer really identifies with communism, but he sort of embraces that kind of family tradition, and even though he's also loves Marx. So, but here's the deal. I mean, you know, I think that, like Clouscard, his you know, his real sort of concern is with the evolution of the left away from its traditional basis in the working class, and in particular, the role that the left has played in sort of facilitating the emergence of and kind of legitimating the emergence of a you know, a form of capitalism that leaves many people in you know, living a very hard way of life. So I think that that's really sort of and by the way, the way that I discovered Clouscard was through Michel. You know, he specifically cites Clouscard and uses the liberal-libertarian phrase, and that's how I discovered Clouscard specifically, was by reading Michel. One of the things that I find sort of intriguing, of course, is this, you know, this interest in Orwell. And which is a little bit sort of surprising, I find, for an American audience, because I think Orwell is so sort of strongly associated with, you know, the critique of or what is seen as the kind of critique of communism. And it is a critique of communism to some extent in Animal Farm in 1984. But the key idea that Michel seeks to resurrect philosophically and politically from Orwell is Orwell's famous definition of socialism. And I know this appears in The Road to Whig and Peer, but I think it's also it's a sort of leitmotif in Orwell's work, which is the idea that socialism is common decency. And Michel takes this idea very seriously. His argument, in a sense, is one of the things that we lose from when the left abandons its kind of moorings in the working class is this kind of not particularly well articulated, but quite instinctive sense of morality that he associates with the working class. And in a sense, Michel's kind of moral critique of the left is that the left has kind of built all these ideologies, you know, liberalism, a certain form of classical liberalism would be an example of this in his view, but wokeness might be sort of the late kind of version of this, that are fundamentally kind of abstract moral categories that are sort of fundamentally kind of connected from sort of the realities of life. And so his argument, in a sense, is that we kind of that the left loses morally when it you know, disconnects from the working class, precisely because that idea of common decency, which he thinks is so sort of crucial to that way of life, is lost and is replaced with these kind of figments of the sort of middle class intellectual imagination. So to me, those are the key ideas of Michel.
I couldn't be farther from Michel Foucault in his anti-foundational position, in a way, right?
And Yeah, absolutely. And kind of, I mean, there's also a way in which I think Foucault, it is precisely suspicious of people's common
Right.
of the moral assumptions of common people, right?
Right.
That Foucault's point
So
of view,
so I
that's the
guess the
very thing you
first
want to challenge.
right. So that's the first question, right? Which is perhaps what you just articulated is what you mean by conservative,
I think that's right.
right? And well, I mean, it would be kind of a boring title of a book if you said for a left of decency.
Right.
I mean, that's a word that liberals use, right? But maybe in a two-faced way. Um, so, so that's very fascinating. And his Orwell is kind of interesting because there's another criticism of socialism in Orwell, and I was alerted in reading your book on Michel to his essay on James Burnham and
Oh yeah.
the New Class, where Orwell basically makes an argument that socialism maybe doesn't take on a totalitarian form of uh, so ideology or whatever, but uh, Orwell warned against the middle class takeover of socialism, and Michel's hugely interesting in pointing this out.
Yes.
So I do feel that his Orwell is so fundamentally different than the standard uh, Americanized Orwell that we've been taught. So that alone is very useful. He wrote a very interesting, I guess, foreword to the culture of narcissism. It was published, I
Right.
think, in the late
Christopher Lasch. Yeah.
'90s
Yeah.
by Lash, which I read and I very much found very provocative and very interesting. So, but again, we return to this anti-liberal position. Now, one of the things he says in the realm of lesser evil is that this unitary liberal subject, this cosmopolitan liberal subject, is sort of a canard. Like it's actually deeply problematic. Again, the consequence of his critique of liberalism is, I think, where people are going to walk away both amazed, but perhaps you're left with, okay, well, what do I do with this? Because he's challenging all of these core assumptions that animate all of the elite universities and the high culture in the West. So I'm wondering what you might make of that, and perhaps that's why he doesn't associate with communism anymore. I mean, in the America, unfortunately, we don't have a rural communist past. We don't
Mhm.
really. Do you know what I mean? Like, but France does, right? I mean, what were the numbers of the French Communist Party in the 60s and 50s and even in the 70s? Hundreds of thousands of people, right?
And a
We have
major
nothing.
electoral party, major. I mean, they
Oh yeah,
did well in elections
right.
also, at least through sort of the 80s. Yeah.
I mean, the Democratic Socialists of America after 2016 with Bernie Sanders, I think maybe has 100,000 at most, right? So there's that historical fact of France that I think perhaps has led the left in America to look at France in ways that misdirect us from our own context. But maybe you could say, as a final question, Michael, sort of like, how might Michel actually resonate with an American audience in this moment we're living in which we so clearly need to break from the thought patterns of the contemporary left and the self-criticism and so on? But also, perhaps, again, he's an autodidactic figure on the margins of the university. His work really should be read by others like that still read, that still care about thought, care about the canon, etc. So how do you sort of, get the word out on Michel, I guess, if that makes sense? And what might he speak to us in America about?
Well, I'm still sort of finding out. The book actually was released on September 9th, so I'm still sort of trying to find out if that's going to happen, and my sort of experience with these kinds of things is what's the old Lacanian phrase, about the letter always arrives at its destination, and I actually find that there's without delving into Lacan, I think that there's a little bit of truth in the way that sort of political ideas get around. I mean, the trick is to kind of, I'm not a big believer in sort of promotion. You just kind of have to publish something and sort of see who finds it.
Right.
But I guess I would just come back to the point that I made earlier about Clouscard. I'm not sure I've got a better one in relation to Michel, which is, I think that, first of all, that there's a kind of need for a form of intellectual self-critique, and I think that is what Michel provides. And I also think that something that you get from Michel that is either absent or far less pronounced in Clouscard, and this may have something to do with the fact that Michel's Michel has a looser connection to Marxism, but that that he really is kind of drawn to this socialist tradition that sort of emphasizes morality, and which I think is kind of, in a lot of ways, I mean, I was going to say that that's a sort of distinctly unpopular kind of topic on the left. I think that's complicated because I also think the left can be highly moralistic, but as a sort of point of reflection, I think it's kind of largely absent, and I think that's something that that Michel invites us to think about, and that would actually include, and I think this would be a really difficult thing to get a lot of people to think about, is that that as much as the left likes to talk about sort of all the kind of moral outrages that it in many cases understandably associates with Trump and the far right, that it may be that among some of his voters and his electorate, that these kind of principles that Michel is talking about actually really are present and somehow relate to the appeal of the far right and a deep suspicion of the left. I mean, Michel talks, I mean, one of the things that just sort of stood out to me, and I think it's in the interview that I did with him in that book, is and also there's this total essentializing that goes on in Michel, and I don't know quite what to do with it. I'm not completely comfortable with it, because I think it's essentializing, but I also
understand
think
it.
I also think there's some truth to it,
Right.
But like one of the things that just sort of struck out to me is like the way that and I've actually partly because I know some people who in the category that he's talking about who've done this, but like saying that like working class people, and again there's also in the whole issue of what exactly that means today, which is a big discussion too, but like that working class people, like when your car breaks down, they'll lend someone their car, whereas in my sort of circles that kind of thing wouldn't happen,
Right.
and I think it's interesting that sort of Michel sort of takes those kinds of things seriously and thinks that they may inform people's worldviews and political identity, and I think that is something that is important to take to take seriously, that in a certain kind of sense that the left's kind of default way of thinking about politics is precisely in terms of big ideologies. So, if Trump says
Right.
something that is ideologically outrageous, then that's sufficient basis upon which to condemn it. What about the sort of strange kind of disconnect that could exist between people who do indeed vote for a candidate who might sort of embrace those kinds of ideas, but in their own sort of daily life are kind of closer to the standard of common decency that Michel is talking about than maybe is typical of people on the left. I don't know if that's accurate. I don't know if if you could say I'm sort of succumbing to some sort of ideological blindness myself and sort of finding this compelling, but that is what I find compelling about Michel.
Sure. No, I mean, I think it's a tall order for the United States and its sort of current challenges that we're facing to sort of elicit that critical thought faculty in which we can sort of interrogate these categories and sort of detach them from the platitudes that we are fed and propagandized into. But certainly extremely vital, I think, to do so, because he, Michel's work in the recasting of the history of socialism is very critical, I think, even of like Bolshevik socialism. He, you know,
Sure.
he has his own particular reading that is, again, just so singular, and you're going to walk away challenged. It's not, the intellectual engagement is not about. It's one of the things that French theory, I think, has done, perhaps unbeknownst to itself, is it's created this situation where people identify with quote unquote master philosophers. And then it leads others to think that, well, if you're a Foucauldian or a Deleuzian or a Derridian, then you sort of have a requirement to sort of adhere to the master in all things.
Right.
And I think that like this tradition we're trying to bring out is so different than that.
I agree. It's
know what I
very it's first of all, it's just hard to categorize to start with,
Start with, yeah. But that's not like the impetus of how the thought's not inviting that kind of identification.
Agreed.
And
It's not, and it's also not system building, right? I mean, Clouscard a bit more than Michel, but I'm not sure it's the point, right?
100%. Yeah, exactly. And it leads to sort of strange things where people create kind of what I would characterize as almost like frivolous conflicts over attachments to theoretical systems. And I think, to mention where we started, I think that is what's declining in academia, that kind of attachment identification to the quote unquote master intellectuals, in part because we don't really have the economic wherewithal to cultivate master intellectuals in the same way that we did in our current neoliberal university. I think that might be another factor at work here in a certain way. And maybe, as I've said in prior programs, maybe that's a blessing in disguise for critical thought, if that makes sense.
That there was something particularly about that kind of high post-war moment that sort of
fetishized the master.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. Yeah, I think, and I don't feel like we're in that moment right now.
No.
I mean, certainly not in the humanities.
Right. So how do you create critical engagement without fetishization of masters? And I think the thing I'll say on morals of the working class, I think that's a similar problem, is because you could see a tendency, and perhaps this is a psychological tendency, to fetishize the morals of the working class. So that needs to be avoided. Although I don't think that Michel is doing that precisely, exactly. But anyways, well, Michael, I want to just thank you for your work and for this very fascinating and provocative discussion. I'd love to have you back on to discuss more about the Michel work. Final question is, what are you working on now?
I actually am working on a book on Foucault's early thought. We didn't talk about it, but I published a book a year and a half ago
Right.
that on Foucault's childhood that was
right.
That was itself actually meant to be sort of the early chapters of a book on what I call the young Foucault. There's been a few books that have been published about that right now that reflects the fact that there's an enormous amount of unpublished manuscripts and so on that have in fact been published in recent years, especially from the 1950s and early 60s. And I'm trying to piece together what Foucault thought in the early stage of his career, and a little bit to kind of do a kind of just as people talk about young Marx and young Hegel, to do a kind of make a case for that there's such a thing as a young Foucault, and to try and fit that in. And then I'm done with Foucault, but I have to say what I have to figure out what I have to say about this one, and then I'll find something else to do.
We wish you the best of luck in your work, and thank you for listening, friends and comrades. Please support us on Patreon. It starts at like $3, even $1 a month. It helps continue to give you these interviews, seminars, and study groups. Thank you all so much, and until next time.